Hello and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast, Week 14 Waiver Wire Edition. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Happy Tuesday. Happy Week 14. It's a great day to be great. Joining me, as he always does, on this edition of the podcast, PFF's finest, Nathan, the great Jahnke. Nate, what's up, man?
Hey, doing well. I had a weird last week with NFL teams and running backs. We had like 4 different teams go into the game with one starting running back. It seemed like someone else was the starter by the end of the game. So NFL always keeping us on our toes.
And now we have 6 teams on bye in week 14 for some reason that still hasn't quite been explained to me. So I understand, on Thanksgiving week, you want to have the 3 teams playing on Thursday. You don't want to completely deplete your Sunday slate. But we started these in week 5, I think, week 6. Like that was when these teams started. Still doesn't make much sense. But hey, we'll roll with the punches. The rules are what they are, Nate, and accordingly, we will adjust to them. So fun edition of the podcast on the way. We're going to go through all the week 14 waiver wire notes from Nate's 5 to add and usual waiver wire report that you can find on pff.com. Also, I went ahead and I got in the lab, figured out the best and worst fantasy playoff schedules, weeks 15 through 17 for each position. So I'll give you some highlights on that. But as we always start things off with, got to go through the biggest sheeshes from week 13, courtesy of my fantasy fallout Sheesh Report column. All the near misses, drop, touchdown, nullified scores, missed big plays. I got them for you right here. So covering the highlights of the week. The sheesh of the week goes to Bengals wide receiver Tyler Boyd. Absolute layup of an 18-yard touchdown. Should have probably been offensive pass interference to get him that wide open in the first place. Wasn't called though, and unfortunately Boyd had one of the worst drops of the season on again what should have been an easy 18-yard score. We did have 3 reverse sheeshes where I was writing down in my notebook. Nate, I got this big ass Google spreadsheet where I'm just constantly listing all the potential sheeshes throughout the weekend. AJ Brown, 41-yard touchdown. Oh, wait, his foot was out of bounds. Don't worry, he caught another one on the very next play. Christian McCaffrey dropped a 3-yard touchdown. Don't worry, he caught a 3-yard touchdown on the very next play. And MVS couldn't quite come up with a 40-yard catch down the seam. Don't worry, very next play, Mahomes went right back to his guys. So always good to see when the sheesh gods help us out there. Terrible instance there where Jacoby Myers last Thursday night was able to seemingly catch about a 15-yard touchdown, then got absolutely blasted by Bill safety DeMar Hamlin to the point where Hamlin actually got ejected on the hit. So Myers, in all likelihood, going to be in the concussion protocol this week. Couldn't quite hang on to the touchdown the same way that we saw Treylon Burks do when he got knocked out of the game. Wasn't a great week for Aaron Rodgers. I've been consistent on this podcast, even when we had that Thursday night stinker against the Titans, that nothing about Rodgers' arm strength in and of itself is truly washed. We're not looking at 2015 Peyton or 2020 Drew Brees. Still wasn't a good week for him. I mean, when he can't even give the guys a chance to get their hand on the ball, that's when we're sheeshing. So Randall Cobb, 36 and 13-yard potential touchdowns, had a step, couldn't quite get an accurate pass. Allen Lazard had a potential 30-yard gain, and Christian Watson, who obviously continues to find the end zone on his limited touches, was open enough for a potential 64-yard score, if not a 40-yard gain. Once again, the Rodgers could not quite put it on him. Also had more of the same going on in Atlanta. The single highest rate of uncatchable passes in the league, courtesy of Marcus Mariota. So Drake London was open deep for a 40-yard gain. Kadarius Hodge was open for a potential 40-yard score, and another 20-plus yard game. Was not a good day for Marcus Mariota and company. Also wasn't a good day for Tua Tagovailoa. And it's one of these things where I feel like Tua's legacy, people want to rewrite it every single 60 minutes that he plays a game of football. Like the amount of just after a good game, after a bad game. Hell, when he was on a bye week, I had Tua non-believers in my mentions just going crazy just about a quarterback. I wasn't even talking about him, but this was not a good week for Tua. Jalen Waddle, man, not 1, not 2, 3 separate inaccurate targets that probably should have been chunk gains. Tyreek did have one in and of itself, but the big one, man, Jeff Wilson, probably should have been a 72-yard yard house call. Now, Jeff Wilson didn't exactly show the best ball tracking abilities on this sheesh. That said, clearly the coverage defender that was supposed to cover him on the wheel did not cover him on that, and there was nothing but green grass in front of him. Wasn't the best pass, wasn't the best catch. Ultimately, just an incomplete, but again, perfect world, 72-yard score for Jeff Wilson. Would have been nice when you look up actually at his stat line, you see those whopping 0.3 fantasy points that Wilson got us last week. 3 official drop touchdowns on the stat sheet. I mentioned the McCaffrey one that he made up for, and the Boyd. MVS also had a potential 2-yard score, hit him in the chest and fall to the turf. Also, Eckler from 17 yards, Gerald Everett from 20, Jarvis Landry from 19, and Devontae Adams from 6. Not official drops, but certainly would have been a lot cooler if they had held on. Nullified touchdowns by penalties that were rightly called, usually more times than not, but still sheeshes us. Cordero Patterson, 10-yard rushing touchdown taken off the board. Chris Godwin, 5-yard touchdown at the end of last night before Rashad White got the actual game-winning touchdown. And Stephon Diggs with that 41-yard bomb last Thursday night. Only problem was Tommy Sweeney was holding on the play. And just a list of pass catchers who could have had a touchdown with a more accurate pass. Gabriel Davis, potentially from 56 yards out, although did not track the ball all that great in his own right. Tyquan Thornton from 56 yards out when his coverage defender fell down. Too bad Mac Jones threw into the stands. A.J. Brown drew a big defensive pass interference penalty. Could have been another 30-yard score in that performance. Guys, great game from Mike White. Great game from Garrett Wilson. Could have had an 84-yard house call after he toasted Patrick Peterson off the line of scrimmage late in the fourth quarter of that one. Nico Collins, potential 3-yard score. Kirk, Marvin Jones, potential touchdowns that Lawrence couldn't quite get to him. He did find Ingram later on the same drive. Pat Freiermuth, Devin Duvernay, Travis Kelce, more potential touchdowns that simply weren't accurate enough to be caught. And finally, Tutu Atwell. And this one kind of cracked me up, Nate, because we had the NFL Twitter account. Shout out Tariq Woolen, the Seahawks rookie cornerback, who he's had a lot of ups this year, but this was a down where absolutely roasted by Tutu Atwell, but Wolford could not even come close to giving him a chance to catch it. So NFL official Twitter says it was a great play by the defense, but you all know that's a sheesh around these parts. Nico Collins, most unrealized air yards of the week with 187, which is a very high number. Gabriel Davis, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and Justin Jefferson, only other guys above 90. And finally, the guys that got tackled at the 1-yard line and did not manage to score on the same drive. Josh Allen, Zonovan Knight twice on the same drive. Dario Ngumbawale, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who leads the league in this statistic. I'm pretty sure I will crunch those numbers by the end of the year. And Rams wide receiver Brandon Powell. So now with that, Nate, we can officially move on to week 14 after being reminded of all the things that made us cry last week. So love getting that out of the way and love getting to your lovely waiver wire content on PFF.com. 5 to add, drop, buy low, and sell high. And you've been doing a dynasty twist here lately with the buying low and sell high. So about that time of this year again, we'll focus on week 14 for now with your top player to add, Buffalo Bills running back James Cook. Nate, we're all excited about what Cook could bring to this offense, being a 2nd-round pick and, just being this explosive pass catcher that, we'd like to really chase in the NFL. Didn't start out great for him with Devin Singletary dominating snaps, and then they traded for Nyheim Hines, and it seemed like he wasn't going to have a role. But things have started to swing Cook's way. What did you see about his uses last Thursday night that has him atop your top 5 players to add ahead of week 14?
The Bills basically split the snaps between the two running backs, Singletary seeing half, Cook seeing the other half, and Cook basically has played better all season if you look at PFF grades in terms of running with the ball, in terms of receiving, in terms of blocking. So it's not all that surprising that he started to see more playing time. And Hines also got more involved, but he was often lining up as a slot receiver or with 2 men in the backfield. So it didn't seem like Hines currently is really impacting either of the two running backs. It's more probably, if anyone, impacting Isaiah McKenzie's playing time. So it's good to see it's more or less a 2-man backfield in that regard. And with how well Cook played in this game and has played so far, it wouldn't be all that surprising to see Cook see more playing time. So maybe not someone that I'm comfortable starting this week, but someone that I definitely want to pick up because it's been heading in one direction. And if it keeps heading in that direction, then Cook could be a really big player down the stretch.
Season high marks and targets, carries, and offensive snap percentage last week. I mean, 20 touches in that matchup against the Patriots. And to your point, I mean, he's looked pretty good with his opportunities as a rusher, as a receiver. So we all remember, he lost a fumble on his first career touch out there, briefly got in that doghouse, does seem to be breaking out. So look, obviously with your fab at this point, if you still have any to be worrying about, hey, if you need a guy, go get him. Don't be, worrying too much about having that leftover fab. As far as I know, Nate, you cannot take it with you into the next season. That would be a wild league to be playing in. So as you mentioned, 3 of the Bills' next 4 opponents, top half at preventing fantasy points to running backs. So maybe not the easiest schedule, but then again, it's the Buffalo freaking Bills out there. Not many other offenses that we can expect to be flirting with 30 points more weeks than not. Number 2, Giants wide receiver Darius Slayton. Keeping on, man. It's been quite a stretch for him over these past 6-7 weeks. And I know a lot of us had Wan'Dale Robinson fever and we're getting excited about that. Unfortunately, he tore that ACL a few weeks ago and will miss the remainder of the season. Sterling Shepard's been out. Kenny Galladay's been a mannequin. We have Kadarius Toney now in Kansas City, obviously. So the results have been pretty nice for Slayton. Specifically, we've seen him rip off fantasy finishes as a PPR wide receiver. 22, dudded at 73, but then 19, 35, 15, 22, 53, and 22. Yeah, there's a few busts in there, Nate, but there's also a pretty strong sequence of top 24 finishes. How do you like Slayton here ahead of the rest of the season?
I think he'll be pretty consistent. I don't think he'll be a huge player over the rest of the year, but in these articles, I often post these line graphs of how much playing time each player gets over the course of the last 2 seasons. And this season, Slayton's playing time has basically gone straight up each week, going up little by little. So now he's very much a full-time starter. He's been at least consistent in terms of receiving yards these last 5 weeks, at least 60 yards in each one. So I think he can be a pretty consistent player. It's hard to find a team's number 1 wide receiver available off the waiver wire this late in the season, but this is definitely the case. The Giants don't have the greatest schedule for wide receivers the rest of the season, so it's hard to get too excited about him. But I think he's definitely someone that could get in fantasy starting lineups down the stretch, especially if there's an injury or two along the way.
Think of him like Courtland Sutton, which is very sad for anyone like me that was pretty high on Courtland Sutton before this season started. But it's an offense where we're not going to have enough pass game volume to feel great about it. I mean, I listed those finishes. There's a reason why he hasn't finished better than wide receiver 15 in a single game this season. So when we only have one guy out there, yeah, we can feel good about him to an extent. Squeeze him in those top 36, maybe even top 30 with 6 teams on bye this week. But to Nate's point, not someone that we're going to be, answering overly often in close start-sit decisions. Moving on to quarterback, Nate. So it is a situation. I mean, we look at the week 14 buys, and I believe Justin Fields is probably the only quarterback that a lot of people were planning on starting because we have the Falcons, Bears, Packers, Colts, Saints, and Washington Commanders. So maybe a few squads still, unfortunately, being forced to hang on to Aaron Rodgers. You don't have a better option, but shouldn't have too many QB streamer needs out there. That said, if you do, Lions quarterback Jared Goff stands out as your top player to add at the position. This week, it is the projected highest scoring game of the week with a game total of 53.5 ahead of this Vikings-Lions showdown. What has you liking Goff ahead of this matchup, Nate?
Yeah, we've been talking about him for a good month or two now with the upcoming schedule, and his wide receivers are finally getting healthy. This was the first game all season that he had the top 4 wide receivers on the roster, all active. Of course, Jameson Williams didn't see all that much playing time, but we've seen this for every wide receiver that's come back for the Lions recently. They ease him in. They're the basically only team that says we're going to put this player on a snap count and have actually meant it. And they did it this week. So I definitely expect Williams to see more playing time going forward. Goff's top 10 in terms of passing yards, passing touchdowns on the season. And the schedule is pretty decent both this week and the rest of the way. So I'm pretty comfortable if I really need a quarterback adding Goff and putting him in my starting lineup.
I was surprised writing my quarterback article this morning, which you can find every week on pff.com starting on Wednesday. But just the numbers, efficiency-wise and counting stats-wise, between Goff and Kirk Cousins have been so close. And maybe you're like, oh, it's Cousins, it's Goff. Who the hell cares? I mean, Cousins historically, guys, has been one of those quarterbacks where when you look at these metrics, you're going to see him in the top 10 more times than not. I agree. When you watch him play, you're not saying that's a consistent top 10 quarterback. But for Jared Goff, like, this is absolutely the best he has played since 2018. So just good to see that happen again for the guy, because it wasn't that long ago where Goff was a punchline in more conversations than not, talking about his on-field performance. And now down the stretch, man, Vikings, that could be the easiest game against the Jets in week 15, but Panthers is reasonable, and the Chicago Bears in week 17 in Detroit. I mean, that could be a situation, Nate, where even though we don't have teams on bye, Goff could be knocking on the door of that top 12, if not inside it, depending on how things start shaking out in some of these other struggling offenses. So good stuff ahead for Jared Goff, who now has 3 top 7 finishes on the season. And look, it's one of those things where I'm focusing certainly more on the good than the bad, but you brought it up, man. Like, this entire offense was so banged up after the first month of the season without Swift, with Amon-Ra St. Brown dealing with various injuries. Chark was on IR. Reynolds couldn't stay healthy. Like, this was absurd, the sort of guys that he had to throw to. They trade TJ Hawkinson. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that when you bring back all the receivers that, you know, this offense actually trusts, Jared Goff starts putting up some numbers again. At tight end, we have a guy who's got his name in the news because Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett has said that Greg Dulcich is essentially being used as a wide receiver out there. Well, we still call him a tight end in fantasy, Nate, so that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Talk about Dulcich and just a tight end position in general that continues to frustrate even the best fantasy managers among us.
Oh, yeah, we've constantly seen injuries, and with those injuries, those targets aren't going to the backup tight ends. They're going to other wide receivers, or they're not using just one tight end to replace that player. They're using multiple tight ends. So it's not looking good if you don't have one of those top 3 or 4 guys. But Greg is someone that has an upside that a lot of tight ends don't have. He's gained 85 yards this past week. There's not many tight ends that have gained over 80 yards in a game this season, and he's done it twice. Travis Kelce, George Kittle, the only other tight ends who have done that twice since week 6, which is when he started playing after his injury. So he's just someone that he has the upside that a lot of other tight ends don't have. And the Broncos have had a ton of injuries at wide receiver recently. None of their top 3 wide receivers played the entire game this past week. So that just means more targets for him going forward. So has the stats of a top 12 tight end since he's become a starter. And now he's even more attractive because he'll get those targets.
And what's good about what Hackett's talking about there is that they're just willing to throw him the ball, I think, as much as a wide receiver. I'm pretty sure that's all he meant, because this isn't a Mike Gesicki or a Kyle Pitts situation that I went off on, you know, for large portions of last season, because they were legit lining up in the slot or out wide on over 80% of their routes, both of them. I mean, Gesicki was over 90%. Like, some of the stats on that were wild. I believe Chris Godwin last year had more snaps as an inline run blocker than Mike Gesicki did. But Greg Dulcich this year has actually lined up more in line than he has in the slot or out wide. So I think that's kind of a fallacy in our industry when people try to hope for tight ends to get more reps in the slot or out wide. Give me the really fast, athletic, borderline wide receiver in line, where he's more likely to be covered by a linebacker or safety, as opposed to out wide where he's going to have to deal with a cornerback. So yeah, they can always, you know, big body those smaller defensive backs on the outside. It's not impossible. Regardless, though, I'm just very happy Dulcich is getting featured as the pass game option here in Denver, because otherwise, Nate, the only thing I care about with the Broncos these days is seeing if Russell Wilson can, in fact, throw for as many touchdowns as his mansion has bathrooms. Shout out to Kent Wyroch for continuing to give us all the content that we absolutely need. Finally, another tight end here rounds out your top 5, Nate. New York Giants tight end Daniel Bellinger, someone that we saw really starting to get that full-time role before he suffered just that brutal eye injury that kept him out of the picture for a while. What did we see in Bellinger's first game back from eye surgery?
Sure. So to start the season, he was a first and second down tight end. Tanner Hudson has been the third down tight end for the vast majority of the season. Bellinger had one game before the injury where he got the third down snaps, played well in that game, and then he went back to losing those third down snaps before suffering his eye injury. But we saw Hudson get released earlier in the week. Lawrence Cager, who had been the tight end in Bellinger's, he's been the replacement over these past few weeks. He was inactive, so that really opened the door for Bellinger to have that full-time role that he only had for 1 week before the injury. And he had that role, played all but a couple of the snaps. Saw several targets, I think caught 5 passes. Didn't put up a ton of yards, but the fact that he played all of those snaps, that's something that very few tight ends are doing right now. And the fact that he's seeing at least some targets with those snaps is a lot better than plenty of other tight ends are seeing right now. So it probably doesn't have the hugest upside because he hasn't shown to like be a huge red zone threat at this point, but he's seeing playing time, he's seeing targets, and they do have some pretty good matchups later on in the season. So I think he's someone that if you've been one of these teams hurting for tight end and haven't been happy with the production you've seen recently, definitely someone I'd be willing to pick up, and he's available in a ton of leagues right now.
And I know what you guys are thinking. Oh, Greg Dulcich, Daniel Bellinger. This is the best you guys got for us at tight end. If you dare, guys, listen to the top 10 tight ends from last week in fantasy points, because it is absolutely gross. In a week where we only had 2 teams on bye, the top 10 scoring tight ends in order: Cade Otton, Greg Dulcich, Noah Fant, Evan Ingram, Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett, Taysom Hill, Chigozium Okonkwo. That's not bad, Ian. Pat Freiermuth, and then Travis Kelce rounding out the top 10. Kelce and Mark Andrews finished tight end 10, tight end 11. Connor Hayward there, tight end 12 for good measure. So it has been absolutely gross. I don't necessarily think it's going to get all that much smoother. So Daniel Bellinger, someone that's going to be on the field in a full-time manner, you could do worse there. And with that, guys, 2 more subjects before we conclude here. First of all, just some key week 13 injuries to watch. Shout out to our friends over at Underdog NFL Fantasy. Those guys grind on the news all day long and always keep you updated. So always have them on the noties myself, and just some injuries to keep an eye on. Kenneth Walker suffered this ankle injury where Pete Carroll is not specifically ruling him out for Sunday just yet. That said, it does sound like an issue where it's probably going to lead to a questionable tag, I would assume, if not something worse. So Kenneth Walker, Nate, the problem is if he's out of the picture, we had Travis Homer miss last week's game with an illness. DJ Dallas actually got banged up himself with an ankle injury, was able to return though. I tend to think if Walker's going to be out of the picture, we're just going to see them put more of this game on Geno Smith's shoulders than we're used to seeing. Probably a 3-back committee consisting of Homer, Dallas, and who else would they even have out there?
Tony Jones was the other.
Tony Jones, that's who I was forgetting. Yeah. So, I mean, would any of those, I guess Homer would probably be the one I'd expect to lead the way because he kind of had that pass down roll over Dallas. That said, even on a week with 6 teams on bye, I don't think Homer's going to be breaking into our top 24 all that easily.
Yeah, it really depends who's healthy and who's not. If there's just one of these guys who's healthy and is going to see all the carries, they do play the Carolina Panthers, which is a team that I think they will be able to have a lead against. So they will be able to run the ball plenty, even though they'll use Geno to get the lead, but they'll still want to use a running back to maintain the lead. And they're a team that likes running the ball. So even if it's one of these receiving backs, I trust Homer the most out of all of the backups if he's healthy. But if both Homer and Walker are injured and DJ Dallas is healthy, then Dallas is someone that I'd be at least worth considering. But right now with waivers, like, you don't know which of these guys is going to be healthy and isn't, so it's kind of hard to pick any of them up at this point. So there might be someone on Sunday. It might be all the way up until inactives are announced that we know how this backfield could shake up. But it's at least worth keeping an eye on.
That's definitely the most consequential injury to keep an eye on this week. At quarterback, luckily, Tua's ankle injury, not a big deal. Jimmy Garoppolo, of course, did break his foot, expecting to miss the rest of the season. So Brock Purdy, for now, I wouldn't be shocked, though, if Josh Johnson manages to work his way into that competition sooner rather than later. Not expecting Baker Mayfield to get signed there, I believe, per ESPN's Adam Schefter. We will see what happens there. But yes, obviously a downgrade for all those weapons in San Francisco. I'm sure they'll continue to make some great plays because they're all great players. But again, going from Jimmy Garoppolo to Brock Purdy, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that it's going to not be quite as much consistent production for all parties involved. We do have Aaron Jones dealing with a shin injury. Luckily, he has a week 14 bye to get right. Treylon Burks suffered that concussion on his aforementioned great touchdown catch. Wouldn't be surprised to see him miss a week. Unfortunately, in Tennessee, it's just really tough to trust anybody in this passing game. I mean, we were getting high on Burks, Nate, and it was still like, yeah, Burks playing great. A lot of things going for him. Tannehill is finally showing a little bit of a passing floor, wide receiver 32 type of deal. So no, Robert Woods, Nick Westbrook-Ikini, not guys I'm overly reliant on this week. If we lose Cortland Sutton to this hamstring injury, that's obviously great news for Jerry Jeudy and Greg Dulcich, because Lord knows there's not much passing production to go around in Denver these days. Russell Wilson, man, 1 game this season with multiple passing touchdowns. Geno Smith has 10 such performances. Not too shabby. Further hurting the tight end, available option options. Hayden Hurst dealing with a calf injury and Isaiah Likely dealing with a shoulder injury. Also have Quez Watkins hurt with a shoulder as well. So I think the only other point, Nate, here is what to make of Lamar Jackson's knee injury. Now, Harbaugh did bring up that it's not a long-term injury, but he's not expected to at least suit up this Sunday against the Steelers. Bringing in Tyler Huntley, who, if you look at most passing statistics, you're going to see Huntley near the bottom of the list in a lot of those, especially things looking at efficiency, yards per attempt, PFF passing grade, all that. But Nate, we're not playing fantasy football for good efficiency. We're playing for raw counting numbers, and he has done a pretty good job of getting those over the years. Overall, he's had 6 extended appearances over the past 2 seasons, and he's averaged 205 passing yards per game. That's not a lot, but in Baltimore, when you combine it with the rushing usage, it actually ends up being pretty good. So before Lamar got hurt last week, he was averaging 203 passing yards per game. So I'm not saying to cross out Lamar's name and put Tyler Huntley there, but Nate, especially on a week with these buys, how do you stack up Tyler Huntley? To me, he feels like a quarterback who has a chance to be a lot better in fantasy than he is in real life.
I definitely agree he'll be better in fantasy than real life because he has that rushing production. I was looking at his numbers last year, and he had one game where he was the top overall quarterback one week, and then a lot of weeks where he was somewhere between 10 and 20. So he shined in one week, and he's probably a little lower than a top fantasy quarterback in most weeks. So I think we could see that again. Looking at the schedule, I wasn't overly excited over these next couple of games, but during the fantasy playoffs, I was fine picking him up if you have Lamar Jackson and just need a replacement for Jackson, and you're in a league where the top 20 quarterbacks are already taken. In that case, I would definitely pick him up. But in most leagues where a lot of teams might not have a backup quarterback, or if you're only in a 10-team league or an 8-team league, then probably not worth looking at him.
Shout out Dwayne McFarland, my lovely former full-time co-host. Now we just talk on Sundays. But he basically said we're looking at, a Baltimore version of Daniel Jones. I thought that was a good way of putting it. So you brought up the rushing numbers from last season, man. Again, 6 extended appearances. He's gone for 40 rushing yards, 45, 73, 54, 72, and 41 on at least 6 carries a game. Also found the end zone 3 separate times. So look, a lot of that did come last season when we saw Lamar be way more effective as a passer as well and more productive. So it makes sense if Huntley, like Lamar, takes a little bit of a step back through the air on this version of the Baltimore Ravens. But quarterback needy teams out there, don't be shocked if he can get things going for you. All right, guys, before we keep it moving, as I explained on the last podcast, had some cuts at PFF, including our guy, Kevin Cole, which is incredibly unfortunate. But Kevin did reach out, and even if he hadn't, I'd be telling you guys this. He is keeping the Unexpected Points podcast and newsletter, basically, with all of his info going. So you can go subscribe to Kevin at unexpectedpoints.substack.com. Again, you guys heard Kevin? Like, I don't even need to hype the guy up. You know how smart he is. You know the unique way he looks at things, just being able to show us, hey, I know he pisses off a fan base every week, but that's what happens when you're trying to do, good, solid, objective analysis. And I can't think of anyone that does it much better than Kevin out there. So Unexpected Points substack.com. Fantastic newsletter. It's free. It's going to make you smarter. I mean, all of Kevin's analysis, the DFS Showdown stuff, like if you're listening to this podcast, if you've been following PFF Fantasy, you're well aware Kevin's a sharp guy. That's why all his work was always behind a paywall. It is absolutely free as Kevin continues to work his way through this funky fantasy football industry. So again, unexpectedpoints.substack.com. Go help a brother out. Kevin Cole, one of the sharpest guys in this industry, dear friend of both mine and Nate's. Unexpectedpoints.substack.com. All right, guys, had Daniel reach out in the chat and actually ask, are there any defenses either of you are stashing for the playoffs? And that is a great transition to some of the most fantasy-friendly schedules ahead of the fantasy playoffs, and specifically with the defenses. I tweeted these out last Thursday, I believe. So if you want to go back and scroll through a bunch of BS that I usually tweet, you can find these red and blue charts. So the top 5 defenses in terms of their opponents they're facing in week 15, 16, and 17 and what they've allowed this year. The Chargers are number 1. the Chiefs are number 2, Vikings number 3, Lions number 4, and the Raiders number 5. So look, we always want to find this happy medium between having a defense that obviously is good at football and then facing that bad offense. So I would say out of this group, the Chargers qualify if they can get Joey Bosa back, but if not, man, it has been rough for them. They cannot stop the run to save their life recently. More likely, we have the Kansas City Chiefs, the Vikings, and the Las Vegas Raiders to a slightly lesser extent as those groups I'd be targeting. So overall, I know the Chiefs are already going to be owned in a lot of leagues, but man, Vikings, even the Lions to an extent with Aiden Hutchinson, some of the things that pass rush can do, and the Raiders, these are pretty low-owned defenses that, again, just based on a purely schedule standpoint, are set up pretty well for the stretch run. On the other side of things, bottom 5 schedules for the fantasy playoffs on defense: Patriots, Texans, Saints, Cowboys, and Steelers. So if you have the Patriots, if you have the Cowboys, I would take just a second to maybe consider trying to get one of these units with a better overall matchup run down the stretch. And moving on to quarterback, Nate, top 5 schedules. Number 1, our guy Mike White set up gorgeous in weeks 15 through 17, followed by Kyle Allen, who we don't care about, Aaron Rodgers, who we're not sure is going to keep the job, Sam Darnold with the Panthers, and now Brock Purdy with the 49ers. So, hey, man, Mike White, it's been a situation where he's gone for over 300 passing yards now in 3 of his 5 starts. And one of those starts against the Colts, he got injured very early on. So he's against Buffalo this week in Buffalo. I don't think that's going to be pretty. He threw 4 interceptions against that defense last year. But, Nate, it does seem like Mike White here down the stretch, I'm not saying he's going to be a top 10 fantasy quarterback, but right there in that top 15, I do think is possible if he can just keep Zach Wilson on the bench.
Yeah, and you mentioned the good schedule and playing Buffalo next week. He's going to be down against Buffalo. He threw 57 times last week. They're not afraid to throw it 50 plus times, so probably depends on how much interceptions hurt you in whatever your league settings are, but White will at least probably see a lot of volume against Buffalo, and then the easier schedule will also definitely help him down the stretch.
3rd most pass happy offense in the league when they've had one of Joe Flacco or Mike White under center. So look, a lot of those games they have been trailing, and I took out garbage time from that statistic, so that removes some of it. But either way, doesn't take a rocket scientist, doesn't take a fantasy analyst to tell you that the Jets are a little bit more willing to pass the ball when Zach Wilson isn't under center. On the other side of things, bad schedules down the stretch. Trevor Lawrence, 3 consecutive bottom 7 opponents, and just in terms of being really tough for him to score fantasy points with in those final 3 weeks. Also Patrick Mahomes, who we know can overcome just about anything. Taylor Heineke, Ryan Tannehill, and Kirk Cousins. So specifically for Cousins and Trevor Lawrence, I would say if you do have, a roster where you've been going back and forth on quarterbacks throughout the year, those would be the 2 I am most concerned about. Moving on to running back, the top 5 schedules for the fantasy playoffs: Saints, Chiefs, Ravens, Rams, and the Colts. So obviously with the Colts, we have Jonathan Taylor, who we're starting even if there's a fire, but these are some interesting backfields otherwise. With the Chiefs, Isaiah Pacheco, someone we've been talking about an awful lot on this podcast over the last month or so of action. We're feeling good about him, but there is more uncertainty in Baltimore and the Rams. Cam Akers really did take back over the backfield last week after it looked like Kyron Williams was moving in the right direction. Do you have any lean on what's going to be happening the rest of the way with Los Angeles, Nate? I feel like the only consistency we've had in that backfield is the general inconsistency from week 1 to honestly now here we are in week 14.
Yeah, Kyron Williams has at least consistently been the 3rd down back since he's been with the team, so he'll at least see some playing time, and especially if they're playing from behind, that'll mean more playing time. But it's very unclear who will be the early down back, and that's the one who will be getting all of the carries. So I'd probably avoid both of them until we see at least a little bit of consistency. And by the time we see consistency, it'll probably be the end of the fantasy season.
Unfortunately, probably a similar sentiment with the Baltimore Ravens, who we saw Gus Edwards really start the season and have a really big line share of the backfield touches, get injured, come back, and have the same thing happen. And then last week, guess what? Kenyon Drake came in and made things much more close to a 2-back committee. Justice Hill is also staying involved, and J.K. Dobbins is going to be back potentially as early as this week. So just one of those situations where the backfield, because of the way Lamar and now Tyler Huntley also play the position, bottom 3 in just overall rush attempts and targets to their running backs on the season. So not expecting to be able to take advantage of this too much in Baltimore. But hey, Isaiah Pacheco, Alvin Kamara, maybe Jonathan Taylor fantasy managers should be feeling good, especially Kamara with Mark Ingram now apparently being potential to miss some time. On the other side of things, Bengals, Raiders, Browns, Chargers, and the Panthers, the teams with the worst fantasy playoff schedule. So, hey, it's a tiebreaker, guys. If we have Joe Mixon, Josh Jacobs, Nick Chubb, and Austin Eckler, obviously you're starting them absolutely no matter what. I think the one more interesting one, Nate, could be what to make of Deontay Foreman and the Carolina Panthers. So with Carolina, they're coming off a bye. Really good matchup this week on the ground against the Seahawks. But after that, Steelers, Lions, and Buccaneers. Now, we saw before the bye, Chuba Hubbard come back and in a game that they beat the Broncos in, really have more involvement alongside Deontay Foreman than I think we've seen in past weeks. Deontay Foreman, when the Panthers can play with a lead or just keep the game close, always a threat to have 20-plus carries and make good usage out of it. I'm just not sure with these matchups and with the potential game script that will go along with playing the Lions and Buccaneers in particular, how many opportunities he'll have to do just that. So in your opinion, Nate, Deontay Foreman, have we already seen his best games, or is he someone that maybe I should continue to try to give people some good start-sit advice and keep him rolling? Because again, he is always a threat to have those 20 rush attempts per game. I get that. I'm worried about that floor when you don't have a pass catching back and you have an offense like the Panthers who, hey, they have impressed a little bit. I mean, my God, they've had 5 games with over 20 points in their last 6. Can you imagine if we had anything close to that in Denver? We'd be going crazy over here. But thoughts on Deontay Foreman the rest of the way?
Yeah, I'm probably not going to be too comfortable starting him in most of those games, but I'll at least keep him on my bench just to see if something happens. If one of those teams that he's facing injures their quarterback, for example, then the game script could be a lot more reliable for Carolina in a way that would mean that he'd get his carries. So probably keeping him just in case something like that happens, and something like that's probably a little more likely than some of the other handcuff situations that you care about, but probably not someone that I feel too comfortable keeping in my starting lineup.
Top 5 wide receiver schedules for the fantasy playoffs. Number 1, the Baltimore Ravens, followed by the Carolina Panthers. Makes sense. You have a hard running back schedule. Things look up for the passing game. Number 3, the Houston Texans. Number 4, the Green Bay Packers. And at number 5, the Cleveland Browns. So once again, there's plenty of guys on these teams that are already going to be owned, already on rosters, that are starting really regardless of how good or bad the schedule is. There is more opportunity here, though, Nate, than I think some of the other positions we've gone over. With the Ravens, I mean, Demarcus Robinson going out there and really emerging as the number 1 receiver more weeks than not. I know Duvernay's still involved, but honestly, both of these guys, like the Baltimore Ravens, just haven't been able to establish the run like they've wanted to and been able to in past years. So having this, again, really fantasy-friendly stretch run for Robinson and Duvernay. If you're in one of these 14-team leagues with, 3 flex spots and you got to get gross, you can do worse than some of these receivers on Baltimore that, again, are legit top 2 wide receivers in the offense, and you don't see that many guys available with this nice of a schedule down the stretch. Similar sentiment in Carolina and Houston. No, we don't love these passing attacks, but also you can't usually find legit top 2 wide receivers on the waiver wire, and if they are going to boom, it would make sense to be in their cozier matchup. So Terrence Marshall and Nico Collins really standing out there. And then with the Packers, Romeo Doubs coming back, I still tend to think it's just going to be Watson and Lazard having most of the success, but you could imagine. And with Cleveland, Nate, like someone we made sure to bring up last week because he was just on the border of being owned enough, but Donovan Peoples-Jones and a Browns offense that I do think will look better in future weeks. But rough start to Deshaun Watson coming back, but makes sense that the dude was rusty. On the other side of things, bottom 5 fantasy playoff schedules for the wide receiver position: Chiefs, Vikings, Jaguars, Rams, and the Titans. So I think we can just move on to the tight end position, Nate, before we head out of here. Top 5 fantasy playoff schedules for tight ends. Number 1, your New York Jets, similarly aligned there with Mike White. Number 2, the Indianapolis Colts. Number 3, New England Patriots. Number 4, the Carolina Panthers. And at number 5, the Green Bay Packers. So really the only guy from this group that we know is going to be a full-time player and have a chance to really take advantage of this is Tyler Conklin with the Jets. We haven't exactly seen him, really boom here with Mike White under center, Nate. It's kind of been just the Garrett Wilson show and everything else. How confident are you in Tyler Conklin potentially, not quite maybe emerging as a league winner, but giving us a couple top 12 finishes here down the stretch?
Yeah, not overly confident, but he has had some games with a lot of targets. It hasn't happened with Mike White at quarterback, but there also haven't been many opportunities for that to happen so far this season. So there's at least a chance. And really, at this point, you're looking for any kind of upside at tight end, and he's at least seeing the playing time and has the upside. So I definitely think some top 12 finishes could be in store over these next 4 weeks.
I mean, the dude had 6 catches, 79 yards, and 2 tutties against the Patriots with Zach Wilson under center. That dude should get a freaking medal for that performance. And you said it, hasn't had a ton of great target games like he did with Joe Flacco, weeks 1 through 3, 7, 9, and 8 targets. He did get up to 7 targets last week, but only caught 2 of them for 9 yards. So I would say the only problem with Conklin is we have seen CJ Uzomah not overtake him by any stretch, but be involved enough just to make things that much more thin for Conklin. So one of my favorite sayings over the years, if you have 2 tight ends in real life, you probably have none in fantasy. Unfortunately, that's been the case in New York more times than not this season. On the other side of things, bottom 5 tight end fantasy schedules: the Eagles, the Browns, the Lions, the Seahawks, and the Saints. So I thought that Taysom Hill could potentially emerge as one of these quote unquote league winners down the stretch, Nate, because if there was going to be a cheat code that could happen, it would be Taysom Hill having tight end eligibility and overtaking Andy Dalton for the starting quarterback spot. But man, I know PFF are getting some flack for having Dalton rated so highly as a PFF passing grade and stuff. And I do think that you can look a little bit more at the way things are done and critique the fact that maybe we are giving too much credit to players like Dalton, who play a little bit more safer than a gunslinger who probably gives their offense, a higher ceiling. That said, man, even last night, I don't think you can watch these Saints games and look at Dalton and say he's playing at a low enough level to get benched, especially when considering he just got Jarvis Landry back. I love Chris Olave, but not exactly an offense overflowing with viable pass catchers. I mean, my God, if we have to keep throwing the ball at Taysom Hill as much as we are. I know the guy caught one last night, but hasn't been all that pretty out there. Any thoughts on Taysom Hill here down the stretch? Probably the toughest fantasy player to figure out all season long.
Yeah, I expect it to be more of the same. I was kind of hoping he'd see more snaps at tight end last night after Juwan Johnson was out with an injury. So they were down at tight end. They let Nick Bennett, I think, was their other tight end that they let go recently. I think he's with New York now. So they were really down a couple of tight ends compared to what they usually have. JP Holt's another one that they left on the practice squad. So he was their clear number 2 tight end, but that didn't really lead to any more playing time. But luckily he got the touchdown, but didn't do all that much else. And even with the problems they've been having at running back, he hasn't been running the ball as much as he was before. So still someone that definitely has that upside of being able to score a touchdown or breaking a big game that a lot of other tight ends really haven't seen a ton of this season, but still just isn't seeing as many opportunities as you would like to see.
Only 1 carry inside the 5-yard line all season long for Taysom Hill. Hasn't scored a rushing touchdown since having that breakout 3-touchdown game against the Seahawks all the way back in week 5. So it was a good thing he caught that touchdown last week. I mean, that was his first one since week 7. He did drop a short fade in the end zone against the 49ers in week 12. So they're trying. And guess what? There aren't any other tight ends out there that have the ability to get these rush attempts and even the occasional pass attempt out there. So still a sky-high ceiling for Taysom. I'm just, I guess, a little bit more bearish on his potential for him to actually take over the quarterback spot from Dalton down the stretch. Give me some Jameis, please. I know they won't, but I just want to see Jameis under center for someone at some point, Nate. But that's going to wrap up this edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. Again, you can find all of Nate's waiver wire stuff at pff.com. And if you're interested in analyzing those schedules a little bit more, seeing the exact week-by-week breakdown, you can go to my Twitter. I sent it out on November 30th at 5:34 p.m. Best fantasy football schedules for the fantasy playoffs. Blue is good, red is bad. Great day to be great. Nate, let the people know what you got at pff.com. And I hope you folks got a while because this is a laundry list.
So yeah, it's same as usual. Right now we have the recaps to every game that happens that went out Sunday throughout the games going on. It happened last night after the Monday Night Football game. Top 10 recap that went out on Monday. Waiver wires that went out on Monday. Today had the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, which included dynasty guys in the buy low to sell high, with the trade deadline gone in most leagues at this point, as well as rest of season rankings that went up today. Tomorrow we'll have rankings for this upcoming week, and the day after that we'll have start and sit.
on top of all the behind the scenes stuff you do already, Nate. A true grinder among grinders. Appreciate everything, man. We'll be back with another edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast tomorrow. Gonna have to be solo, pretty much, running out of people to talk some ball with here over at PFF these days, but that's okay. We will watch the film and get better as always. I think my plan is just get through all my articles, come up with, 15 or 20 of my favorite notes and takeaways, and just tell you guys the goodness, hopefully get those rosters in a position, make the fantasy playoffs, and then take home that championship gold. So for Nate, I'm Ian. Thanks as always for tuning in to the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. Until next time, take care, everybody.